Hello, we welcome you to our study today. If you would, please turn to Mark chapter 14 and let's begin. Last time we studied halfway through the chapter, and today the plan is to continue with verse 32. Verses 32 to 42, we read how Jesus prayed in Gethsemane. Then they came to a place which was named Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." Note briefly what Luke and John wrote. Luke 22:39, coming out, he went to the Mount of Olives, as he was accustomed, and his disciples also followed him. John 18:1 and 2, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Note from both Luke and John that Judas knew the habits of Jesus as his disciple. It says in Luke 22:39, he was accustomed. And in John 18 and verse 2, Judas also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. This was not the first time that they had come to this place named Gethsemane. According to John, there was a garden there, which he and his disciples entered. Here in verse 32 of Mark 14, we see how Jesus and his disciples came to this place called Gethsemane. He told them to sit while he went and prayed. Sit here while I go over there. Matthew 26:36. In Luke's account, Jesus said, pray that you may not enter into temptation. Luke 22:40. And so Jesus told his disciples, sit here. And according to Luke's account, while they're sitting, pray. Pray that you enter not into temptation. Verse 33. And he took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. Jesus took his disciples, Peter, James, and John, with him to pray. The other disciples were left to pray by themselves. This was an occasion that Jesus chose to share personally with these disciples. Think of the events that they personally witnessed. They saw Jesus heal Simon Peter's wife's mother in Mark 1:29. They saw him raise the ruler's daughter in Mark 5:37. They saw his transfiguration in Mark 9:2. And they heard him explain the prediction of the destruction of the temple to them personally in Mark 13:3. And so Jesus was very close to these three disciples, Peter, James, and John. Note that it said that Jesus was troubled and deeply distressed. It says, then he said to them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch. Jesus was troubled, deeply distressed, and exceedingly sorrowful as the time of his death drew near. Earlier, Jesus had told his disciples, sit here while I pray, verse 32. Then he took Peter, James, and John with him, verse 33. Now he told them too, stay here, watch with me, Matthew 26:38. Jesus wanted them to watch, to stay awake with him. Verse 35, he went a little farther and fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. According to the passage, he went a little farther. How much farther did he go? According to Luke's account, Jesus had withdrawn from them about a stone's throw, Luke 22:41. Someone has suggested this was about 50 feet. He knelt down on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He was close enough to his disciples that they could see him, that they could hear him. But here we see that he knelt down and prayed. The hour was the time that he was being betrayed. He said that the hour might pass from him. That hour was the time that he's being betrayed that would result in his death on the cross. Verse 41. In verse 36, and he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. Jesus said in prayer, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. All things are indeed possible for God. Logically, this would exclude all things contrary to his divine nature. However, Jesus prayed, and the prayer of Jesus was not solely a matter of what was possible for God, but what was the will of God. If humanity was to be redeemed, then the ransom must be given. Despite experiencing trouble and distress and sorrow over his impending death, the Son was resolved to follow the will of the Father. Matthew 26:39, O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Luke 22:42, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will, yours be done. And so we see in each of the accounts, Jesus concerned with the will of God. What was possible for God was one thing, but what was the will of God? This term Abba is an Aramaic word that means father. When Abba occurs in the New Testament, it is used as a term of endearment, not for just anyone, but for God, and is followed by the Greek word translated father. It's found a few times in the New Testament, here in Mark 14:36, Romans 8:15, and Galatians 4 and verse 6. Verse 37, then he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? After Jesus had prayed, he came to his disciples and found them asleep. He said to Peter, Simon, are you sleeping? Again, he was not asking the question for his out of ignorance to learn, but to teach. This was Peter, who earlier vehemently protested or professed that he would never be made to stumble or to deny Jesus. And now he was sleeping on the night of the betrayal of Jesus. Mark 14:2-31. Jesus said, what? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Matthew 26:40. Verse 38. Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. The disciples should have been watching and praying. However, they were sleeping. Jesus taught Peter to watch and pray lest he enter into temptation. The time was approaching that there would be temptation for his disciples. Jesus also knew that Peter was willing in the spirit, but he also knew that there was weakness in the flesh. Matthew 26:41. Verse 39. Again, he went away and prayed and spoke the same words. What words were those? Well, like we've seen earlier, also in Matthew 26:42, Matthew's account reads, again, a second time he went away and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. And so he prayed a second time, the same words to the same effect. Verse 40, and when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. According to Mark's account, The reason why they fell asleep was because their eyes were heavy. And so perhaps being exhausted. For what reason? Matthew 26:43, and he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. Well, we'll see an indication of that later, the answer to the question. Why were their eyes heavy? Verse 41, of course, being late, but there was another reason. Then he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. So here we see how he left them and went away again, prayed the third time, saying the same words, or words to the same effect. And sometimes according to Luke's account, sometime as Jesus prayed during the night, an angel appeared to him. According to Luke, the angel from heaven was strengthening him. It may be that the angel appeared to him as he prayed the third time. Luke 22:43. Then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And so Jesus came to his disciples the third time. They were still sleeping and resting. Jesus said, it is enough. The time to watch was over. He had told them, watch and pray. But the time to watch was over. The hour had come. The hour for his betrayal was there. In Matthew 26:45, Matthew's account reads, then he came to his disciples and said, are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Verse 42, rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. The disciples were still on the ground where they were sleeping and resting. And Jesus told them, rise, let us be going. And as he predicted, Jesus was being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Mark 14:41. The man who would be his betrayer, who would betray him, was at hand, or near time at that time. Matthew 26:46. And so Jesus prayed 3 times. The first time, verses 35 to 38, the second in verses 39 to 40, and the third in verse 41. We see the sorrow of the apostles during this hour. Jesus had told them how that he would die. And now the hour was at hand. Why were they sleeping and resting? Their eyes were heavy, perhaps heavy with sorrow, as they thought about their Lord and Savior, as they thought about their teacher, their friend. In verses 43 to 50, Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. Verse 43, and immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude, with swords and clubs, came from the chief priest and the scribes and the elders. And so while Jesus was still speaking to his disciples, Judas came from the chief priest and the scribes and the elders of the people. And Judas, who was one of the 12 apostles who would betray him, was there with them. There were many people there with swords and clubs who followed him, who followed Judas, who led them. Matthew 26:47. Also in Luke 22:47, it says that Judas went before them. Not that he was in charge of them, no, but that he went before them as a guide, to guide them to Jesus. In John's account in 18 in verse 3, then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Of course, we know why they needed lanterns and torches. It was night, it was dark. It was also cold. Why all the people? Why all the weapons, the clubs? The multitude here came out prepared for armed resistance. What might they find? Would Jesus' disciples resist? How many would be with him? From our studies of the book of Mark, we note that the general people received him and that there were multitudes and multitudes of people who followed Jesus. These events occurred during the night. Here, Judas leads the people or goes ahead of them to guide them to Jesus. Verse 44, now his betrayer had given them a signal, saying, whoever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely. Judas would signal the multitude, this group of soldiers, with a kiss. The plan was that whoever he kissed, that is, kissed as a kiss was often given as a greeting, whoever he kissed, he was the one whom they should seize. As it was dark, the kiss would help them to identify Jesus so that they could arrest him. Judas cautioned them to lead him away safely. Was Judas concerned with the safety of Jesus? It doesn't appear so. Upon first glance, perhaps. But this word safely is also translated as securely. For example, in Acts 16:23, and when they had laid many stripes on them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them securely. And so note how that in discussion of Judas, or in discussion of Paul and Silas, when they were put into prison, the jailer was commanded to keep them securely. That word translated securely is the same one translated here as safely. And so seize him and lead him away securely. Secure him. It's hard to understand how Judas had fallen away to the degree that he had. Here in verse 43. Seize him and lead him away safely. Make sure he doesn't get away. Verse 45. As soon as he had come, immediately he went up to him and said to him, Rabbi, Rabbi, and kissed him. Again, it's hard to imagine that he could do this to him. Judas immediately went up to Jesus and he greeted him, Rabbi, Rabbi. The term rabbi means teacher, like we see in John 1:38. Jesus asked Judas, friend, why have you come? We see this in Matthew 26:50. Again, Jesus asked the question not to learn, but in this case to expose his treachery, him being a traitor. According to Luke 22:48, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? He knew full well what he was doing. He knew that Judas was betraying him, and he exposed this to him and the others. And with these words, we see that Jesus exposed Judas as his traitor. After this, it appears that Judas went back and stood with them. According to John 18:5, we see whose side he was on. In John's account, we see that Jesus confronted the multitude, openly announced himself, and demonstrated his power at one last time. If you'd like to read more, it's in John 18:4-9. This seems to have occurred after Judas betrayed him with a kiss. By coming forward, Jesus made the kiss of Judas, which served to signal the people, irrelevant and vain. Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? And then he goes forward, according to John, and announces himself. Who are you seeking? Jesus of Nazareth. I am. And they fall back. And so we see his power, but also his acknowledgement of himself, who he was. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't trying to escape. His hour was at hand. Verse 46. Then they laid their hands on him and took him. In Luke 22:49, when those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? As you read Mark's account, Mark omits various details and adds others. You would expect this with a witness. And we see that in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Of course, by comparing each of the accounts, you can get a fuller picture of what happened at that time. And in this case here, like in Luke 22:49, we see that the disciples could see what was going to happen. That is, that they were going to lay their hands on Jesus and take him. So they asked the question in Luke 22:49, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? What do you want us to do? And so in Matthew 26:50, men came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. So what do we do? Verse 47, and one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. There's nothing to indicate that Jesus answered them and told them to take out the sword and to strike. Not waiting for an answer, we see that he took out the sword and he struck one who stood by. In verse 47, it says that it was the servant. He was the servant of the high priest, and that he cut off his ear. Well, who's the one who took the sword? Who's the one who drew the sword from the sheath and struck the servant of the high priest? Well, if you just read Mark's account, you wouldn't know. But if you read John's account, John provides that detail. That's why it's important not to just study one account like Mark, but also the others, Matthew, Luke, and John. John 18:10, then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So we learn from Mark's account that he cut off his right ear, that the servant's name was Malchus, and that it was Simon Peter who drew the sword and struck the high priest's servant. What did Peter think he was doing? What did he think he was going to do? Was he going to fight off the whole multitude by himself with one sword? He may have been emboldened by Jesus' confrontation with the multitude earlier, his boldness before them, his bravery, his courage, his power, as we saw in John 18:4-9. Such a demonstration of power by Jesus may have served to also save Peter's life too. And we'll note why in a moment. Why did Jesus say that after Peter struck the servant Malchus? Well, Jesus said to his disciples, permit even this. Then he touched his ear and healed him, according to Luke 22:52. He told Peter, put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that my Father has given me? John 18:11. Of course, there's much more to learn, and we're briefly mentioning some of the other gospel accounts to supplement our study here of Mark. In Matthew 26:52, Jesus said to him, put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you not think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus? And so we see that Jesus told them to put the sword away. Again, it was his time. It was the will of God. Verse 48, then Jesus answered and said to them, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? Again, what did they expect to find? Did they expect a strong resistance on the part of the disciples of Jesus? Such a show of force was not necessary. Was Jesus a robber? No. He wasn't some violent offender. He did not try to hide. He did not try to escape. Instead, he revealed himself to the multitude, as we see in John's account. His disciples would offer no further resistance other than Peter. Here in verse 49, he continues, I was with you daily in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. So if you wanted to arrest me, why didn't you do it when I was in the temple? Jesus points out that if they wanted to seize him, why come at night? Why come during the dark with torches and lanterns and swords and clubs? They would not have needed Judas to betray him, to guide them to him. They did not try to seize him in the light when he was teaching in the temple daily. He says, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. One of the scriptures Jesus may have had in mind was that of Zechariah. Zechariah 13:7. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. And in this case, we see the sheep being the disciples and the shepherd being Jesus. Luke 22:52. When I was with you daily in the temple, why? You did not try to seize me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. We see the sin in the people. And we see the influence of the devil. The power of darkness. Of course, this was a dark night. It was a cold night. We see the need of the lanterns and the torches. But we also see darkness in the sense of sin and unrighteousness. Ultimately, Jesus would die for our sins. Verse 50, then they all forsook him and fled. They is the disciples. The disciples forsook him and fled, Matthew 26:56. In John 18:12, then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. They tied him up. They secured him as Judas had suggested. We see in verse 51 and 52 how a young man followed Jesus. This is a detail that only Mark records in his gospel account. Verse 51, now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body, and the young men laid hold of him. And he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. It's a short passage. It's interesting. There are details that we simply do not know. And again, this is only mentioned by Mark. We note that Mark did not identify the young man in verse 51. Given his lack of clothing, having only a linen cloth, it may be that he was awakened that night by the multitude that passed by. Why else would he be walking around out in the cold and the dark with only a linen cloth thrown about his body? We see that it was a cold night. And in Mark 14 and 54, later on, Peter warms himself at a fire. It appears that he recognized Jesus. It says he followed him. So he wasn't following the multitude per se. He was following him. He was following Jesus. Some suggest that he may have been a disciple. There were men of the multitude who saw the young man following him and laid hold of him. Again, he may have been a disciple, or at least they thought he was a disciple, and so they seized him. Some have speculated that the young man here is Mark, the same Mark who wrote this gospel account, who wrote the book of Mark. It's possible. Again, however, it's speculation. It is noteworthy that they did not seize the apostles. In John 18 and 8, Jesus, after his demonstration of power, said, Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way. And it appears that the multitude let his apostles go their way. They fled and they did not pursue them. However, this particular man was seized. He was not an apostle of Christ, though he may have been a disciple. And if he was a disciple, this may indicate how that they were seizing all those who were with Jesus, or those who were following him as his disciples. Verse 53 to 65. The young man left the linen cloth in the hands of the men, and he fled from him naked. So whoever he was, we see that he followed Jesus for a time, and they saw him, they tried to seize him, and he ran off with his linen cloth still in their hand. Before we look at the next passage here in verses 53 to 65, we want to note that there were some 6 trials or phases of trials for Jesus. The first 3 before the Jews and the last 3 before the Romans. There was Annas, Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, and there was Pontius Pilate, Herod, and also Pilate again. We see the first, Annas, in John 18:13. The others, Caiaphas in Mark 14:53 to 65, the Sanhedrin in chapter 15 and 1, Pontius Pilate in Mark 15:1 to 5, Herod in Luke 23 and 6 to 12, and again before Pilate in Mark 15, 6 to 15. So I mentioned that to indicate from the gospel accounts the various trials of Jesus. Now in verses 53 to 65, we note that Jesus is led away to the high priest. So Mark doesn't record how Jesus was first brought before Annas, but he begins by saying how that Jesus was brought before Caiaphas, the high priest. And so in verse 53, and they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. So those who laid hold of Jesus led him to Caiaphas. It's not indicated in this passage, the name of the high priest, but it is in Matthew 26:57. Caiaphas, the high priest. The chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled with Caiaphas. They were assembled in the high priest's house. Luke 22 and 54. Remember, it was the chief priests and the scribes who sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. That was back in Mark 14 and verse 1. They kept it quiet in order to avoid an uproar among the people. Again, the people received him. Here they hold a secret meeting at night and in a private home. As you study the events that unfold with the trials of Jesus before the cross, you see just how much they broke the law. As I mentioned earlier, first Jesus was led away to Annas, who was the legal high priest. And while this trial was omitted by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it is recorded by John in John 18:13 to 14. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. That's in John 18 and 24. So that brings us up to our passage here in Mark 14:53. Verse 54, but Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. I would think it would take some measure of courage to do what Peter did. He followed Jesus, yes, at a distance, but he followed Jesus right into the courtyard of the high priest. The idea that he went right into the courtyard, which was private property of the high priest himself, I think that would take courage. The servants kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat together. Luke 22 and 55. Again, it was a cold night. Peter sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. And according to Matthew 26:58, he warmed himself at the fire, waiting to see the end. To see the end. Matthew 26:58. The end of what? The end of Jesus, the death of Jesus. Verse 55. Now the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. That's what happens when you have an innocent man. Now the chief priests and the council, they sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, to execute him. However, despite their search that night, they found none. None that would be worth anything for their goal. Matthew 26:59, Matthew pointed out how they sought testimony. They sought false testimony. There was no true testimony that Jesus had done anything wrong. And any testimony that they could possibly find would have to be false testimony. And even with that, they had difficulty trying to find people that would agree together the same, that would have some measure of consistency. We want to note that the law condemned false witnesses. I think that's pretty obvious, but the law of Moses for the Jews, it condemned false witnesses in Deuteronomy 19:16-21. And yet here you have the high priest, and you have the chief priests and the council seeking false testimony against Jesus to put him to death. This shows the corruption of these people, of the chief priests and the council who were present that night. Verse 56. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. So there were many false witnesses which came forward. However, despite searching for witnesses that night to testify against Jesus, they could find none whose testimonies agreed. They were not consistent. Verse 57. Then some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. So, verse 57, there were some who bore false witness against Jesus who had a similar testimony. There were apparently many things that were said, but this is the only thing that came close to agreeing, to being consistent, and it wasn't consistent. Matthew 26:60, it says, but at last 2 false witnesses came forward. They said that they heard Jesus say, I will destroy this temple made with hands. Within 3 days, I will build another made without hands. Did Jesus actually say that? No, he did not. The Jews wanted a sign from Jesus. Now, if you go back to John chapter 2 and 19, you see the words of Jesus. The Jews wanted a sign from him. So Jesus said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. However, Jesus was not talking about the temple made with hands. In the context, he was speaking about the temple of his body, John 2 and 21. When they destroyed his body, he would raise it up the 3rd day, in 3 days. After he died, he would resurrect. He would raise again. That's what he said. Destroy this temple in 3 days, I will raise it up. Speaking of himself. You want a sign, you will have a sign. Kill me and I'll raise from the dead. There was the sign. Verse 59. But not even then did their testimony agree. So even when they said these words of this verse 58, that Jesus said something that he didn't say, even then their testimonies did not agree. They were not consistent. And the high priest stood up in the midst of them and asked Jesus, saying, "Do you answer me nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" It must have been frustrating for this man, for these people gathered there at that late hour at night, trying to find something to pin on Jesus so that they could put him to death. Caiaphas stood up. He questioned Jesus, "Do you answer nothing?" He asked Jesus about the testimony that was brought against him, however inconsistent. So far, despite their search, they could find nothing, no real evidence to put him to death. So what would they do? Verse 61. But he kept silent and answered nothing. Again, the high priest asked him, saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus remained silent, and he did not answer Caiaphas. Nothing had been proven. From what Mark recorded, it appears that Caiaphas had already questioned Jesus about his identity that very night. Note that Mark wrote in verse 61, again the high priest asked him. So he had asked this before. Again, he asked Jesus, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Blessed in this case is another expression for God. And so, are you the Christ, the Son of God? Matthew's account includes the oath. Caiaphas said, "I will put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Verse 62. Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Jesus said, "I am." He affirmed that he was the Christ, the Son of the Blessed, the Son of God. He continued to describe how they would see the Son of Man at the right hand of the power, coming with the clouds of heaven. These corrupt men would see him at the right hand of God in the final judgment. Here they are trying to judge him, trying to bring false witnesses against him, trying to condemn him, and yet one day they would see him in the judgment. Matthew 26:64, Jesus said, "It is as you say." Verse 63, Jesus acknowledged, I am the Christ." Well, what did they say? Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "What further need do we have of witnesses?" Caiaphas, the high priest, tore his clothes, feigning horror at the words of Jesus. Think of the outrage. To tear the clothes was a sign of mourning. Sometimes it was a sign of repentance. Certainly it was not a sign of repentance for the high priest. He was feigning outrage, feigning or pretending horror at the sound of Jesus' testimony. I am the Christ, the Son of God. Unable to find suitable witnesses to testify against Jesus in order to condemn him, hearing the testimony of Jesus, he dismissed any further need for witnesses. What need do we have of witnesses? It's much like saying, what need do we have of evidence? Of course, they had already determined that they were to have him killed. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't about righteousness. And so the show he put on of tearing his clothes was pretend, righteous indignation. Matthew 26:65. The high priest tore his clothes, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look now, you have heard of his blasphemy. What do you think?" And they answered and said, "He is deserving of death." This is in verse 64. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. And so Caiaphas called upon the chief priest and the council. He accused Jesus of speaking blasphemy, of speaking evil of God, by saying, "I am the Christ, the Son of God," by saying, "I am the Christ, the Son of the Blessed." Yet they condemned him of blasphemy. Certainly, it was not blasphemy. Jesus truly was. Jesus is the Son of God. From the very beginning of the book of the Gospel of Mark, Mark 1:1, we see the gospel of the Christ. Verse 64, they all condemned him to death. What do you think? So what is your judgment on this matter? And they condemned him. He's deserving of death. How was he deserving of death? In the law, in Leviticus 24:16, the law said, "And whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him, the stranger as well as him who is born in the land. When he blasphemes the name of the Lord, he shall be put to death." Here in the passage, we see that the law condemned blasphemy. Well, it also condemned false witnesses too, but that sure didn't stop these men. Again, we see how corrupt they were. But Jesus did not commit blasphemy. They committed blasphemy. Why do we say that? Think about what they did and said of Jesus. Put aside that they're condemning an innocent man. Jesus is more than simply a man. He is the Christ, the Son of God. And look what they're doing to him. That is blasphemy. Of course, they couldn't see that. They would never acknowledge it. Luke 22:63 and Matthew 26:67, we see what they did. They did to him. Here in verse 64, they condemned him. 65, then some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him and to say to him, "Prophesy." And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. So they spat in his face, they blindfolded him, they beat him, and they struck him with the palms of their hands. Then they mocked him for his affirming himself to be the Christ, and told him to prophesy to them who struck him. Remember, he had the blindfold on. This kind of behavior was not even appropriate for the worst of offenders. And yet look what they're doing to Jesus of Nazareth. Yet the high priest is consenting to this atrocity of a trial. Matthew 26:67, they spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is the one who struck you?" And in Luke 22:63, now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who struck you?" And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. They are the ones who committed blasphemy, according to Luke 22:65. Verses 66 to 72. Peter denies Jesus. Remember earlier in our last study, we noted how that Jesus predicted that Peter would do just that. Verse 66, now as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came. And now if you compare Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you see in the various accounts those who saw Peter and who pointed him out as a disciple. and how Peter denied Jesus. Here in verse 66, now during the trial of Jesus, Peter was out in the courtyard. Remember, he's warming himself by the fire. One of the servant girls of the high priest came to the courtyard. Verse 67, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with Jesus of Nazareth." And so this servant girl of the high priest, Caiaphas, saw Peter getting warm by the fire. It says she looked at him. Luke 22:56 says she looked intently at him. Have you ever saw somebody you thought, I know that person? And then you look intently. Well, in this case here, she remembered who he was. You also were with Jesus of Nazareth. Verse 68, but he denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you are saying. And he went out on the porch, and a rooster crowed. And so Peter denied it. He denied it before them all, according to Matthew 26:70. And he said, I neither know what you are saying, nor understand what you're saying. And he went out on the porch, probably to get away from her or get away from the others. However, that was not successful. And at that time, we see that a rooster crowed. That's important because it's a part of the prediction of Jesus made earlier in the chapter. Verse 69, and the servant girl saw him again and began to say to those who stood by, this is one of them. So she's not stopping. She's pointing out to everybody around. There's the other servants standing by, the other servant girls, the other servants in the courtyard, now on the porch. This is one of them. So this is one of the disciples of Jesus. This is one of the men who was with Jesus. And so she confronted him again, and she followed him out on the porch, and she began to tell others that he was with Jesus. But he denied it again. So here we see the second. And a little later, those who stood by said to Peter again, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it. And so Peter again denied being with Jesus. A little later, some who stood by said that Peter was surely with Jesus of Nazareth. They were confident. They recognized that he was a Galilean by his speech. Galilean accents differed from Judean accents. In Luke 22:59, it says, then about an hour had passed. Another confidently affirmed, saying, surely this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean. So when Mark says a little later, according to Luke, it was about an hour later, and about an hour had passed. Verse 71, then he began to curse and swear, I do not know this man of whom you speak. To curse and to swear does not mean to use profanity. In this case, we see that Peter was denying knowing Jesus of Nazareth. To curse is to call for a curse or destruction to come down upon him if he was lying. And to swear is to promise with an oath. And so he's cursing and swearing. Swearing that I do not know the man, and cursing in that if I'm lying, then let something happen to me. I do not know this man of whom you speak. John included mention of the relative of Malchus who confronted Peter. In John 18:26, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. And so here that second time, a rooster crowed. Then Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And when he thought about it, he wept. The rooster crowed the second time, Peter remembered what Jesus said to him. He didn't realize it at first, but when he thought about it, he wept. Jesus said in Mark 14:30, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And that he did. Peter denied him 3 times that night. Mark 14:30. And when Peter thought about it, he wept. In Matthew 26:75, it says, so he went out and he wept bitterly. And much the same is written in Luke 22:62. Peter went out and wept bitterly. We remember how strongly Peter denied that he would ever deny Jesus, that he would ever forsake Jesus. And yet look what had happened. Remember in the garden, Jesus taught his disciples, taught Peter and James and John to pray, lest they enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Certainly, Peter was willing to follow Jesus. But here we see the weakness of the flesh, and that Peter denied Jesus 3 times that night, the night of his betrayal. So he went out and he cried. Peter later gains strength, returning to the Lord, and continues on as Jesus' disciple, unlike Judas Iscariot. Well, that's all the time that we have today, and that's the end of the chapter. This is the second part of a 2-part lesson on Mark 14. Lord willing, we'll continue with chapter 15 next time. We hope that the lesson has been helpful. There is way too much information to try to address in such a short time. I know we've spent this time tonight looking at the chapter. We've looked at a lot. There's certainly more to learn, and so we encourage you to study on your own and continue to study God's Word and meditate upon it. Again, we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you for being here today.